the effects, the net effects of carbon dioxide proliferation around the globe are almost permanent. It takes ages to take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and therefore the impacts in terms of climate impacts wherever you are going to be there for at least the end of your lifetime, the end of your children's lifetime, and the end of your grandchildren's lifetime, unless something is done about it. So that's an interesting kind of take on it. There is, however, a little spin side to this, which is rather interesting. The spin side to this is that there is a what's called in Canada, they have a massive kind of tree species that lives above the 49-degree latitude. So this, in fact, the species is so large in Canada, it's the spruce tree, but they basically have a population that is roughly the size of Spain in terms of forest. Now, before this, they were measuring what the effects of increased temperature would have on these forests. Now, of interest, what's happened is, because the increased temperature causes the snow to melt a bit earlier, it increases the amount or volume of water that's available in the soil, which means that roughly, for the first time ever, these forests get roughly an extra 3 to 4 weeks extra growth time. So it means that you have more trees that are able to grow, which is actually a kind of converse spin on carbon dioxide and the mitigation of carbon dioxide, because these species cover roughly 30%, or they are 30% of all tree species, but they contain in their bodies roughly 20% of all the world's carbon. And they're keeping it already in their bodies. The 49-degree latitude goes all the way across Europe into Russia. So it's a massive piece of forest. But the point being is that for the first time, the net impacts that these trees will actually have appears to be beneficial in terms of having increased heat. So they may actually improve our opportunity to mitigate the effects of carbon dioxide. The disadvantage, however, comes from the fact that because there are more trees growing with less water to draw from, that increased growing period may prove negative for other surrounding species. So that's the first kind of subjective condition. The second subjective condition is that it's on the basis that the climate remains stable, meaning that the temperature in the area remains stable. If the temperature in the area increases further than this, and greater latitudes are caused to melt earlier, you're going to have a kind of shake-up of all the events, meaning that there will be more water drawn from the soil, less species surviving, and it could start to unravel. But for the moment, it appears that that is actually going to work. Now, I don't know what's going on in Norway. I don't know. The Norwegian people are, I seem to be talking about Norway quite a lot. And not always in a good thing, because, I smash Norway a lot about that whole dolphin kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, generally the news that is coming out of Norway, the news that they had recently in relation to getting rid of fuel and diesel vehicles completely and switching over to electric vehicles. But now Norway has actually done something else, and they voted in Parliament last week that they want to, so they're already on track to meeting their neutral output in terms of carbon dioxide output by 2030. Now that's 20 years ahead of schedule. They were committed after COP to making that schedule by 2050. But they've become so good at it, the whole focus of their country is so focused on it, that they're actually going to meet their schedule 20 years ahead of schedule. So that means, as a country, Norway may become the first country to be completely carbon neutral. Now, there is a little spin side to that, you see, because that's just popular advertising. It's almost, in a way, propaganda advertising, because Norway also happens to be one of the largest energy exporters in the world. They have plenty of oil reserves that they export, these oil reserves. And so even though Norway itself may remain carbon neutral, the byproduct of their exports may not be taken into account in relation to that. So it would be interesting for me to find out whether or not they are referring to reducing their carbon dioxide emissions enough to actually also account for the usage of their main export. But either way, I think we've got to take our hats off to the to the Norwegian people. They're spending roughly $3.6 billion a year just to achieve this. And they're going to achieve it. Ironically, their environmental minister, he tried to go against it, not for any other reason other than saying, look, we've been given until 2050. Why must we do it 20 years ahead of schedule when it's going to cost us so much money? But the MPs in Norway are absolutely driven and determined to do it. And my hat's off to them, my respect to them, and we need more leadership like that. But I'm going to revert back to this point once I've just covered another horrible little piece of news. And this news is kind of, it's important because many times I've spoken about how climate change has affected various different things. Many times I've discussed about how it affected the lions or it affected different creatures. But we now at the point where for the first time a mammal species has been caused to go extinct as a result of climate change. Now, what is big about this is that it is the first such mammal species recorded to become extinct as a result of climate change. So this species, I'm going to tell you a bit about it, and it doesn't have an easy name. Like, it's not like El Rato or some simple name. It's got like a complex name, and it's something that we need to, I'm going to have to read if you don't mind, so just bear with me. The creature is called Bramble Cay Melomys. Okay. But of interest, it was only found in Bramble Cay, which makes sense, in northern Queensland. And it is a tiny little mouse, basically, that lived on a tiny portion of the Great Barrier Reef. So it was actually an endemic reef species. But the rising tides caused by increased kind of temperature around the globe, caused by extra melt, has caused the high tides to remove its once great. It had 64 hectares of ground that it could run around on and subsistence kind of live off, eat what, I don't even know what they eat. I'm sure they eat used to eat something. But the tides dropped that down to basically where they had 0.64 hectares left in which to range. And that was just enough to wipe out an entire species. So if you think about it, here we had a species that has survived countless extinctions. It survived asteroid impacts. Its whole chain, its whole branch, its whole genus has managed to get it through to this point of where, okay, it wasn't abundant, but it occupied a niche inside of the world, and it flourished in that niche. It was first identified in 1856, and it was a living species that now will never ever see the light of day again. Now, it's not the first extinction that has happened in our time. We had the yellow sea dolphin, which became extinct due to the amount of toxic junk that has been poured into the rivers around China. But it is an extinction, nevertheless, that is directly attributable to climate change. And so, as a result, I think it's something worth paying attention to. The biologists that were researching this matter said they believe it's just the tip of the iceberg. They believe that there is a lot more mammals and other animals that have been directly impacted by climate change that will never see the light of day. You and I will never hear about it, but it's happening. It's happening. People are changing, things are shifting, the world is changing around us. Now, I'm going to do 3 quick things because I don't like to keep you too long. Generally on the internet, people have a kind of 5-minute lifespan in terms of watching something. So I'm going to give you 3 stories I'm going to cover this week. The first story is in relation to the damming of one of China's last rivers. Every single river in China is dammed, the Yangtze, all of the big rivers have been dammed. There is one last refuge that has been running obviously since China's been about, but now China is looking at putting hydropower on that river, and obviously it's to meet their own kind of climate objectives. They're the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world, and they have undertaken amongst themselves to correct that. But that's a big story and it's unfolding soon. The second thing is that in Germany, the German government basically has put forward a motion. Now, it's important that I say put forward a motion and not say they've decided, but they've put forward a motion that by 2050 they're not going to have any more any more diesel vehicles or any more petrol-driven vehicles. So you can see around the world economies are shifting. countries are shifting. There is huge emphasis that has been pouring into the kind of changing of the world to make us more efficient. But the thing that is both remarkable, both in Norway and Germany, and also in Israel, they're also kind of playing a role, is that it takes the people to talk about it. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We are talking about it, we're bringing it to you, you're talking about it, and as a result, we're going to start to shift everybody down the same line. As usual, I'd like to say, I would like to hear from you. If you've got any stories or anything of interest that is happening in your area, we'd like to see it, we'd like to screen it, we'd like to put it on our 24-hour news channel, and more importantly, we'd like to hear from you. So, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching. It's going to be a freezing cold day today, but we'll make it. I'll see you at the end of the week. Thanks. Hello and welcome to the Mother Channel, and welcome to the Environmental News Network. My name is Jason Saul, and we are reporting once again from the beautiful, scrumptious Monkey Valley Resort in Cape Town. Over my shoulder you have the lovely long 8-kilometer unspoiled stretch of Nuruk Beach, and the sun is shining, hallelujah. Today I have some very important stuff for you, and this is really important. This is more important than anything else, because today I'm going to tell you how merely by being a couch potato you are going to save the world. It's going to take two things for you to do. And I actually had to toss up to myself on exactly what I'm going to call this episode. Well, not that I have much say over it, but I was either going to call it Waking Up the Sleepers, or I was going to call it How to Save the World by Being a Couch Potato. But I'm going to cover 6 stories quickly. I'm going to kind of go a little fast through them, but I'm going to prove to you at the end of this kind of episode exactly how being a couch potato is going to change the world. So our first story is based around China. Now, as you know, recently China has taken a lot of paddy whacking simply because they went ahead with that stupid Let's Eat the Dog festival. Now, as a person who loves dogs, you know, I think it's disgusting. I really don't understand it. They even post pictures up of them like kind of preparing the dogs, you know, and it really injures me deeply to have to watch images like this. And I understand it's like not my culture, it's their culture and everyone's culture, but I don't like it. But what China has done, or fairly recently has done, is they've decided to halve the amount of meat consumed in China. So their objectives is basically to lower carbon emissions as a result of reducing the amount of intake that the public eats. Now, the government has issued a guideline on how much meat people should be eating in China. Now, I find that a little strange. I think it's a little weird that the government issues a mandate on how much meat people eat. I think it's great, because ultimately at the end of the day 14.5% of the total emissions of carbon dioxide comes from the cultivation and ultimately the eating of livestock, of pork, of cows, of pigs, you name it. 14.5% of all global emissions merely comes from livestock, and I'm talking CO2, not just talking CO2, I'm talking methane as well. So in China, they've basically said that everyone can only eat 40 grams to 70 grams of meat per day, which obviously, you know, in turn implies that they were eating 80 grams before. They are intending to save roughly 1.015 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, as well as methane emissions, by the end of 2050. So this is important because, as we already know, that China accounts for the largest production of carbon dioxide in the world, and I think it's a very good initiative of them to take. I'd like to see some more initiative taking place, but for the meantime, in this specific case, China has actually done a good thing. Our story is then going to turn over onto the southwestern parts of the United States, where, as you know, there are massive raging fires going across all of the United States. They're primarily in the southwestern, in this case, southwestern parts of the United States, where these fires have raged, on for almost the last 2.5 months. The local fire department believes that they're only 10% contained. But what's interesting here is the relationship between the wildfires that are occurring and climate change. Now, this drove a guy called Michael Mann. He's a professor of climatology and meteorology, to basically release a statement saying, which is why I actually incorporated it, is that you ain't seen nothing yet. Michael Mann basically says, and this is all in Fahrenheit, so they mention 160 degrees Fahrenheit. He says that the persistent drought and persistent high temperatures that are occurring inside of California and the southwestern parts of the United States are causing so much dry fuel for the fire to consume that it's almost impossible to A, stop, and B, that we are actually just on the beginning of what is ultimately going to unravel in terms of too much heat, too much carbon dioxide emissions. And in his case, he actually says it, and I'm going to quote him here. He said, if we continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels, by the mid-20th century, mid-century, what we think of as extreme heat today will become a typical summer day. And that is from a professor, Michael Mann, and he's referring to the wildfires that are occurring. It's interesting that he's referring to the wildfires because they're all kind of linked. There's another story that came out in the week saying 66 million trees in California have died as a result of drought. Now, as you know, that these are all kind of interrelated. If you remember last week in my last fantastic release, we were talking about how the warmer weathers have actually created a larger growing window for species above the 49th degree latitude, so tree species, but the increase in species has caused more drought because there's more kind of plants drawing. Geez, bird, chill, dude. Wow, that bird was just freaking out. Final parting shot. Had to get it off. So now we're talking about in California that there's a massive drought. It's been going on for quite a bit of time in California, but as a result of it, there has been roughly 66 million trees estimated to have been lost. Now, they've lost in two ways. First of all, the drought itself has caused many trees to die. But what that's done is that's invited beetle to basically come in, start eating the trees, and that's caused a beetle infestation. And this is actually a massive problem. And if you go back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of Michael Mann and his topics about how the heat is causing the driving kind of wildfires, I think that you're actually looking at two stories starting to unfold that are ultimately going to coalesce into a single story. And I think you're likely going to find that the story from last week in relation to above the 49th degree latitude, those trees, I think it's going to coalesce into these stories too, which is the thing that I find amazing about what's going on in our industry, in climate change, is how all the little bits and pieces of story are starting to come together to form one big scary picture. So talking about a scary picture, there is a scientist, in this case his name was Professor Jeremy Owens, who's a geologist, and he did something quite clever. He went back and took a look at ice samples to determine exactly what effects the increase in carbon dioxide levels would have upon the oceans. As you already know, we've already discussed ocean deoxygenation and ocean acidification as a result of the increase in temperatures. Now, he wanted to find out, what potentially could be the end result of this all. How bad could it go? And so what he did was he had to dig really far. He had to dig back to 94 million years ago in order for him to find out exactly what kind of conditions we can expect as a result of our continued use of fossil fuels and our continued lack of caring in terms of emissions. And what he found was that 94 million years ago, once the carbon dioxide levels reached where they are now, there was massive dieback. First of all, it started off with a loss of proteins inside of the water, which in turn ultimately got rid of certain species that were feeding at the top of the water, which in turn caused deoxygenation in the water, which in turn drove massive extinctions throughout the oceans. Now, don't you find this story a little bit similar to the story that we told earlier, well, about 3 weeks ago, in relation to the deoxygenation of the ocean? Here is a guy that basically had to go back 94 million years in order to find out what would happen. And here we are, 2016, and you seeing it starting to happen. I think it is time, if anything, to start worrying about this. But of more worry would be if you were an environmentalist in this day and age. Environmentalists generally are considered tree huggers, people that run around and they try to do good things. But there is a record that was made inside of this week, and it was in relation to the murder of environmentalists and people that are ultimately trying to stop the onslaught of big business against our natural resources. So far, there have been 185 murders. Primarily, okay, even though spread over 16 countries, most of the murders took place in Brazil. Now, you find that interesting. Brazil is at the forefront of where people are trying to stop the logging that's going on in the Amazon rainforest, the slashing and burning that's going to cultivate soy crops, etc. And instead of people trying to work out a way and understand, like, you know, that maybe the impact of their product on the environment is so bad that they would actually just look at doing something else, look at making another way instead, they found it easier to murder people. And I think this is coming to a point where you're going to see a lot more of this. You're going to see a lot more of this. And just for the record, I'm just a presenter in this case. I really, you know, I'm going to try and stop a whole lot of people. But please, you know, I kind of like living. I like listening to the sound of the bird. I don't want to get murdered for my interests, and I think if anyone, you know, is going to be doing murdering, you know, I don't know, you know, go back yourself maybe if you're a destroyer or polluter of the environment. But all of this brings us together to the actual reason why I was so excited about today. You see, because today is going to be a day that I am going to tell you how to fix the environment. And now, one of the common problems that we had ever since we've started, in fact, in anything to do with climate change, is that people have this lovely line that they like to do. Oh, what can I do? What can I do about climate change? And then they carry on destroying the environment. That's what they do. And so I'm going to tell you the easiest, fastest way to fix climate change, to fix the environment and everything else. And all it will require is two things. That's all you got to do. The first thing you got to do is you just have to watch. Isn't that amazing? Like, you just have to watch stories like mine, not just mine, stories that are being spoken about but you have to start informing yourself about what's going on in the environment. You see, one thing that I've known about Environmental News Network is every time I seem to do my research on what's going on in the world of environmental science or climatic science, the one thing that is a resounding obvious thing is that the major news networks have zero interest whatsoever in covering any of these stories. So to a large extent, you're being kept in the dark. You're actually part of what I like to call the sleepers. Now, I'm going to come to the sleepers now because I'm going to explain to you how you're going to wake up the sleepers. It is going to be your responsibility. So what's going to happen now is this. All you need to do is watch this presentation. Watch other presentations that are like mine. Fill your head with the facts that I'm talking about. I'm not making these up. I'm not sitting there going, hey, you know what, I feel like talking about the southwestern drought at the moment. I'm not making it up. This is publicly available information that is relevant to what is going on in the planet. And it is super important. Do you know, while we were talking about the death of the Great Barrier Reef, the CNN was talking about Donald Trump. How important is that? Which would you rather have, Donald Trump or the Great Barrier Reef? You decide. But the point is, by watching it, you're informing yourself. And what happens is this. In Germany, I mentioned this inside of my last discussion. It's my first link that I've done with a previous show. But in Germany, They put forward a concept, politicians put forward a concept, and they basically said by 2050 we're going to have no more diesel and petrol driven vehicles. Now, what happens inside of any democratic political process is it's a bunch of hot, like kind of air-speaking people that are going to find out whether or not that position is supported by the electorate underneath them. Now, if the electorate underneath them has absolutely no idea of what's going on, and they just set their minds on focusing on watching Al Jazeera, CNN, what's going on with the Kardashians, when the politician comes to them and says, what do you find important? They're going to spit out the usual garbage, jobs, they're going to spit out, whatever, crime. They're going to spit out things that are relevant to them. It's true, they are relevant, but they're going to miss out on the big picture. The big picture is, in a few years' time, in fact, a report that's just been released saying by 2035, 33% of the world will be in severe water restrictions, is a big story. You can have crime, you can have a job, but if you've got no water, you're going to be having a rough day. But if you let the politicians know that, hey, I'm awake, I know what is happening in the world, what happens is you form part of a demographic. And the politician then looks at that demographic and he says, the people that elect me, pay my salary and ensure that I can drive around in my big fancy BMW are really concerned about climate change. That's what they're concerned about. What do you think is going to happen to that bill when it is tabled inside of the German parliament? It's going to find overwhelming support. It's going to find overwhelming support because that is what people are concerned about. And all of a sudden, legislation for Germany is going to change and they will ban the use of petrol and diesel-driven vehicles by 2050. And so what I've just done for you is an incredible thing. I've actually just showed you that merely by watching something, in this case me, and merely by letting yourself be aware of what's going on and sharing it, you are actually able to change the world. You're actually able to change what's happening in the environment. The politicians will jump to whatever the electorate is telling them to jump to. You are the electorate, you have a voice, and now you have knowledge. Now I tried this out myself, okay, because it sounds really easy, okay, just watch me and we're going to change the climate, okay, but I I gave this a test drive myself, okay, and I'm going to tell you this is crazy difficult, okay. I sat down with like the people that I was surrounded with, and these are people, they're like normal people, man. They like go to work and they watch TV and they drink too much on the weekends or too little on the weekends or whatever, and they have a good life. And so in the middle of a conversation, I said, listen guys, how many of you know exactly what happened at the Great Barrier Reef? They're like, they knew nothing about it. They wanted to watch the rugby or they wanted to do their thing. I said, okay, how many of you have heard about deoxygenation of the ocean? And then I sparked up of the group, I sparked up some interest from a few, and I explained to them what deoxygenation of the ocean was. Now, I'm not a scientist, just explained it to them, I just shared it. And yes, there was like a glazed look in a lot of their eyes, it's true. But the reason why that glazed look is there is because they're asleep. People all around you are asleep. If you're watching this, you're not sleeping anymore. You're aware that there is a problem, you're awake to the problem, and you're educating yourself. But it's going to be lost on you unless you share it. And so what I'm going to challenge you all to do, and I want you to try this, I want you to email me on the results set to this, is I just want you to share. Take any information you like, anything that I've spoken about you like. And you sit down with a group of your friends, and in the middle of any conversation you like about absolutely anything, whether it's Brexit, Donald Trump, how Hillary is a liar or not a liar, whatever the conversation, ask them, sorry, do you know what deoxygenation of the ocean is? Do you know what acidification of the ocean is? Do you know that by 2030, there's going to be 33% of the world is going to be at a loss for water? You see, the problem is that most of them are only aware of what they are being fed on national news broadcasters and what they're being told about junk things, sport. and geopolitics and things that are not really that important in the scope of what's going to happen. So you can actually see the slow awakening in some of their eyes. And it is important for you to share the message of what I'm telling you and to share your own message. Research the info yourself, share the information, and start to wake people up. Because when you do start to wake people up and you get a whole group of people all talking about the same thing, the same topics, the same concerns, then all of a sudden those politicians, when they're canvassing, looking for support, that demographic that includes those lists of people that you've spoken to is going to start to change. When it starts to change, legislation will change. When legislation changes, governments change. When governments change, we start correcting climate change. And so that is the chain of events. I want you to try it. Tell me how it went. Even if you like, make a little recording of yourself and tell me how it went. Let's have a conversation if you want. And yeah, so give it a crack. Let me know, and let's have a discussion about it. My last little coverage or topic of the day that I'd like to do, because I don't want to put people to sleep, but the last topic that I've got today is in relation to a meeting that we had last week that was relating to new business. I said to somebody, I said, hey, listen, man, and I was telling him about how I'm trying to change the world and how I'm trying to change people and how hard it is. And he said, Jason, you're never going to change the world, because until new business gets off this concept of GDP growth, a German guy, Rolf, very nice guy actually, but until it gets off this concept of growth, until businesses are assessed based on greenness, we'll never change it. And he's absolutely right to a certain extent. He's right. Why is it that, they muted carbon tax here in South Africa? Why is it that it receives resistance? Why is it that when a coal company wants to open up a new coal shaft and they put forward a business proposal, why is that business proposal only judged based upon the results of the financial return? Why is it that they don't incorporate? Remember, we had the story about these coal ash ponds that were leaking arsenic and thallium into the water systems that were poisoning people. Now that's the result of the business. That is what the business contains. That business, albeit that it does give back returns to investors and it does provide jobs, at the end of the day, in as much as it provides the benefit, it also needs to reflect the offset. Why is it that companies are not assessed based on this, and based on this almost equally by comparison to the amount of profit that is returned from such an investment? How is it that we always are looking to expand and expand and expand when we're not actually looking at that expansion requires resource withdrawal in order to maintain it, to sustain it? These are the problems that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about more about this next week. Rolf had some really, really clever ideas, and I'd like to bring those up to you because I think they're viable. And at the same time, I've given it a lot of thought myself. But for the meantime, I'm going to round up this episode, and I just want to end it on this, and I cannot explain to you how important this is, but we can change the world. You and I can change the world merely by watching, merely by informing yourself, and then trying to wake the sleepers. Just try to wake the sleepers. Make everybody talk about it. Be the person at the table. Watch that glazed look in their eyes clear out as you're talking about the fact that their grandchildren are going to be finished. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They've just been fed only information that big business, big money wants them to hear about how, some tennis match is sponsored by a watch company, how a bunch of rich people go sailing around on boats in yachts, and how Brexit is going to affect the macro European economy. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all meaningless. It's meaningless if you don't have a planet to exist on. You've got to change the conversation, and it starts with you, and I want you to share it. I want you to share it. I want you to be the me sitting at that table amongst all those people. I want you to start to take responsibility for just talking about it. If you work in a company, try it. Try it. In your next meeting, Monday morning, everyone's sitting there hungover, pissed off that they've even got to work. Just try it. Just say, sorry, I just wanted to know what we're planning to do about climate change. Everyone's going to look at you, some people will throw papers at you, some people say climate change is a hoax because you know they're brain dead. But the reality is you're starting the conversation, and that's how we're going to change it. You watch me, I watch you. Hopefully if you send something in, you watch me, I'll inform you, you go out and you share it. Let them know that we're not going to put up with it. We are going to change climate change. We are going to end it. So I want to thank you for your time. The sun is still out, so still a beautiful day, and I hope wherever you are, you're having the most freaky, awesome day you've ever had in your entire life. And go share that news tonight, and let's see what happens. Thank you very much. This is Jason Tall, reporting from Monkey Valley Resort. Thank you. Hello and good morning and welcome to ENN Network. We are filming in the lovely Monkey Valley Resort. Slightly different view today. They're kind of working around us, so things are going a bit wild. Got 5 stories for you pretty much from last week. We are a day off having a full week summary, but the big story of last week was Greenland, which set its melt records in 2015. And this is quite important because according to climate change and climate models, Greenland has an effect called the Arctic amplification. And what that really does is it's based around increase in energy in the northern hemisphere, specifically around Greenland and the Arctic. And the net result of that increase in energy is increased runoff in terms of water runoff from the Arctic. And what that does is it upsets the jet stream. And what the jet stream does is that it moves a bit slower, but it also carries warm air across to Greenland, which in turn amplifies Greenland's own kind of warming cycles. So, before this was always theorized. It was something that wasn't put down as a solid fact, like any theory, any scientific theory for that matter. But for the first time, it's now been proven. It's now actually met the principles of Arctic amplification, and I think we can safely say that it's happening. In another kind of turn of events, some important things actually happen in terms of carbon sequestration. For a long time, scientists have been puzzling about how to get rid of the excess CO2. As you know, we're sitting on 433 parts per million at the moment, which is only 133 parts per million above safe, So they've been looking at means of sequestration. So sequestration, obviously, there's natural sequestration, which I've explained to you in terms of, how phytoplankton goes and absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and changes it, and how trees absorb carbon dioxide, build their body with the carbon. But this is a man-made kind of means of carbon sequestration. It's been tried in a few different ways. In Australia, they tried it by liquefying the carbon dioxide, then pumping the liquid down into old abandoned mine shafts. A couple of labs have come up with some pretty intelligent ways to do it, but none of them really cash feasible. And then in Iceland basically made a massive breakthrough last week, which was they figured that if you were to take CO2, add a bit of water to it, and a bit of sulfide to it, and you inject it back into rich basalt. So in Iceland, they've got a lot of areas that are dense in basalt, and they injected it back into the basalt. Now the trick here was that everybody said the process of it converting from its liquefied form of CO2 into a hardened form of CO2 would take anywhere between 8 to 12 years. And even then, it was considered to be, too fast to be practical. But the big breakthrough came that the carbon not only turned itself into a solid block of carbon, but it did it within 2 years. Which means that effectively Iceland has just discovered the most rapid way to converting carbon dioxide into a solid, stable secure source that can be stored forever underground for pretty much as long as you like. Basalt is a very common rock substrate that's found all around the world. And so this is actually a very viable means of carbon sequestration. And it's something that you can bet they're going to be doing a lot more in the future. And then, obviously, if you've been keeping an eye on CNN, they also brought this story up, but it's in relation to the first time inside of tropical downpours and inside of heavy kind of climate conditions that they've actually been able to detect what they call the fingerprints of climate change. Now, climate change, remember, is a theory, although obviously as it's going on, it's becoming more and more solidified in terms of what they're projecting is actually happening. But for the first time, they've actually were able to take map models based over the downpours that occurred in both France and Germany, and they were able to predict with a degree of accuracy, in this case was 80% and 90%, the likelihood of the Rhine rising, first of all, and then flooding. And they predicted it at 90%, and they predicted a 4.5 meter climb in terms of based on the weather patterns and based on the rainfall patterns, where in fact they were pretty close. It actually turned out to be a 6.1 meter rise in the river, and that's pretty much what's caused all your flooding throughout most of Europe, in fact anywhere connected to the river. These other two stories are a bit more recent, but they're both sort of quasi-related. They've done a study on what's called coal ash ponds. Now, coal ash ponds are places where coal kind of factories or coal mines, they will get rid of waste product, and they will leave it in an ash pond. And these ash ponds can be giant. Now, in the United States, they did a study on 21 coal ash ponds, and some of these are like long abandoned coal mines. And what they've done is they determined how much of that coal ash was actually staying stable and staying within the coal ash pond itself. But what they found was that the coal ash pond was actually leaking toxic materials into the water aquifers, so the sub-aquifers. And all around these various different locations, they were picking up high levels of selenium and arsenic in water, unnaturally high levels. And in some places, the farmers had even started, plumbing into these with boreholes, drawing out that water and spraying it over crops. So what essentially you've got a proliferation of arsenic. Another thing that's of concern about this is that in South Africa we're a massive mining economy. I mean, that's how we make most of our money. Likewise in Mexico, some of the biggest coal mines, Russia, Australia. United States is always kind of like the canary in the cage kind of thing, because they actually take the time to go and do the research, go and do the studies. And when they release studies like this, it's got to make you think, in the United States, they also have some degree of legislation as to how they're supposed to store these kind of toxic materials. Whereas in other countries, they may have kind of lower standards of how they store these toxic materials. But the important part here is that even in the United States, they were finding massive levels of contamination, cross-contamination. Now, can you imagine what the effects of those are on third world economies or on countries that don't have as higher standards in terms of storage? And I think that this is a problem that is probably all around the world. And it's something that, with urgency, we should actually take a look into. My final story of the day, something which really bothered me, up in Tanzania. I'm in South Africa, so it's up for us. In Tanzania, they have been recording how hippos have been accumulating towards the end of a dry season. There's been increased aggression. As you know, hippos are one of the largest kind of land mammals that we've got here in Africa. But there's been a whole lot of aggression, a whole lot of infighting, and in fact, a large proportion of them have actually been dying back. And scientists then went to go study why this seems to be a recurring issue. And what they found is that as the amount of rainfall is getting less and less, a lot more farmers and a lot more people are drawing more and more water from the river. And what this is doing is in these massive parks, they're basically draining the rivers for other wildlife to use, so for the hippos to use. So where before only right at the end of the dry season would the hippos start to make these overnight migrations, they're now actually starting to make these migrations a lot earlier. They're starting to look for new sources of water, mainly because man's impact and the impact that we're having on the environment around them is reducing their probability of survival. Already here in South Africa, they've just declared all of our provinces, well, 7 provinces, they've declared them, disaster drought areas. They actually declared it as a disaster zone. And then on my way here, I just heard that Windhoek in Namibia is going to be out of water by November. And this seems to be like kind of a growing problem. At the forefront of climate change, you always have kind of climate extremes that are occurring. There you see in the Rhine, the River Rhine rising 6.1 meters and flooding down a whole lot of houses. You're getting a whole lot of unnatural weather conditions that are occurring around the world, including in the Arctic, where they're basically breaking up the jet stream and it's carrying more heat into Greenland, which is in turn causing more melting in Greenland. And all of these problems are actually interconnected. But the difference here with the hippos is, at this point, big atmospheric conditions, outside of whether it rains or doesn't rain, but big atmospheric conditions are starting to have direct impact upon creatures, upon animals, and ultimately upon us. We will be carrying the cost of all of these kind of interventions that we do, this persistent dumping of toxic materials into areas that potentially can be they can go out and later leak into sub-water aquifers. You've heard all of the stuff with fracking. They had that movie that went viral on the internet where the guy was able to actually set his river on fire. I mean, it was on fire based on the amount of methane that was on the water. So the fact is that as a species we are completely reliant on water. You can go without food for a few days, but go without water and the world is going to be a very different place. My fear is that we are getting faster and faster and faster into a point where water is actually going to start to play a real part in our lives. And I think there's a time for us to do something, and I think that time is now. So I'd like to hear more about water issues, or I'd like to hear more about any events that are happening in an area near you that are related to water. I think it's a story that we need to track. I think it's something that we need to talk about. If you've got anything, if you've got any news footage that you'd like to bring forward and let us put out and put it on our live stream, please bring it on. We're waiting for it. We're ready for it. But until then, I'll chat to you at the end of the week, and have a good week. Hello and welcome to the Environmental News Network. I'm Jason Sol, and we are filming in the beautiful Goeie Constantia in Cape Town. It's historical gardens, one of the first, in fact the first wine estate here in South Africa, and beautifully belongs to all the people of Cape Town, but locally managed, but just it's a beautiful place, and anybody that's coming to South Africa, I urge you to come and spend some time here. It's a beautiful environment to be in. As usual this week, I'm going to summarize a couple of the stories of this week, and then I've just got a couple of things I want to throw out at you. So it's Sunday today. The big stories of this week was basically based on the renewable energy systems. A professor in Harvard developed what they're calling a bionic leaf, which turns sunlight into a liquid fuel. This has been done quite a few times. Sorry, the dog is just galloping around, so no issues about the dog. But this has been done a few times, but never with this degree of success. This study has actually made it more efficient to produce liquid fuels from sunlight. I don't know why personally. I mean, I think it's a great technology, but I don't know why personally they're still persisting with the whole, liquid fuel kind of concept. I really like, electric vehicles, renewable powered vehicles. I think that's the future. I think, research, albeit that it's good research and an interesting development, I really believe that we should be more focused on developing technologies that are going to be usable for the future, as opposed to trying to still keep with this ridiculous kind of, we need to burn things in order to create power for ourselves. I mean, we've got to move away from this. The second story which I wanted to cover is quite interesting. They've just recently concluded a study of fish larvae and the impact of microplastics on fish larvae. And so the study can now conclude, so it's got a conclusive result which shows how microplastics are able to retard the growth of fish larvae. They also create weaker fish, so fish that are more susceptible to environmental changes, fish that are more susceptible to pollutants in the water, and fish that have shorter lifespans. Now, albeit that, that's interesting and all, when you combine the stories, which is invariably what I find to be quite a way, it's how you should be looking at it, as a larger picture instead of a micro picture. But when you combine it with the information that they released about 3 weeks ago, showing the level of plastics in the water, the level of microplastics in the water, and then at the same time they also showed you the kind of how long plastics are taking to biodegrade. I mean, you're talking like thousands of years. You're talking, I don't know if you know those like kind of helium-filled balloons, those shiny silver balloons that like never biodegrade, ever. They will just never, they will persist forever. So if you bear that in mind as to how much kind of pollution is in the ocean, where before it was kind of isolated to various hotspots in the Pacific Ocean, now you can go and take a cupful of water, any sea, anywhere in the world, and you will pick up a degree of micropollutants, microplastics inside of the water. Some kid came out with a technology, I'm sorry, but I can't remember where, but I think it was somewhere like Norway or Denmark or somewhere like this, that it was a mechanism for taking plastics out the water. Just hold on a second, I think we may have a little baboon encounter